The cry in the snow, the night was dark and silent, and the icy wind moved across the frozen plains like sharp blades. The snowstorm had arrived early, turning the abandoned human outpost on the alien ice planet into a white desert. The storm howled like a living creature, echoing through the empty corridors and broken antennas. Far away from the main shelter, a lone human engineer named Evan was making his way back after repairing damaged signal towers. His thermal suit kept him warm, but the cold was so strong that even his visor was starting to freeze. He walked carefully. Following the blinking lights of the navigation poles buried in the snow, Evan had worked on this planet for months, fixing old structures, maintaining the power grids, and trying to bring life back to this place. It was supposed to be a simple job, just another contract far from home, but tonight felt different. There was something in the air, a strange feeling that made him keep checking his surroundings. The storm had grown worse, and his radio was filled with nothing but static. He increased his pace, hoping to reach his shelter before the worst of the blizzard arrived. Then, something unexpected happened. His scanner picked up a faint sound. It was weak and irregular, almost lost under the roar of the storm. At first, he thought it was a glitch, maybe some broken machinery, but then he heard it again. A cry, soft but real, cutting through the wind like a tiny knife. Evan froze in his tracks. His heart started to beat faster. He turned off his external lights and listened carefully. There it was again, a small, desperate voice calling out through the storm. Please. Human, help Mom. Evan's eyes widened. That was not static. It was a child's voice, broken and trembling, trying hard to speak in human language. For a second, he wondered if it was a trap. This planet was not safe, and there were stories of scavengers and raiders using tricks to lure people out. But the tone of that voice carried real pain, real fear. It was not something that could be faked easily. His training told him to ignore it and return to base, but his heart told him to follow. He activated his heat scanner and swept the area. 2 faint heat signatures appeared ahead. One was weak and fading, the other small and moving slowly. His boots crunched loudly on the frozen ground as he moved forward. The snow grew thicker, making it hard to see more than a few meters. His breath fogged the inside of his helmet. His body shivered slightly despite the suit. Then he saw her, a little alien girl standing in the storm. Her small body was wrapped in torn fabric. Her skin was pale blue and covered with frost. Her large eyes were filled with tears that had frozen on her cheeks. She waved her arms desperately, stumbling toward him. She was shaking uncontrollably. Her voice cracked as she shouted again, "Please! Human, help Mom!" Evan rushed to her side. He wrapped his heavy coat around her small frame, trying to block the freezing wind. Her hands were like ice against his gloves. She looked terrified but relieved to see him. He knelt down and looked her in the eyes, trying to calm her down. "Where is your mom?" he asked gently. She pointed with a trembling finger toward a narrow ice canyon in the distance. The scanner showed the weak heat signature there. Barely alive, Evan knew the canyon. It was dangerous, narrow, and easy to get lost in during a storm. But if someone was out there, they would not survive much longer. He had 2 choices: return to base and be safe, or follow this little girl into the storm and risk everything. He looked at her again. Her eyes begged him silently. She was just a child, lost and cold. He made his decision. He lifted the girl into his arms, securing her against his chest so she could share some of his suit's warmth. Then he turned toward the canyon and began walking. The storm grew louder, the wind hitting his back like waves. Each step became harder, snow piled around his legs, and the temperature dropped even lower. His suit's warning system beeped softly, alerting him that the cold was reaching dangerous levels. The girl buried her face against his chest, whispering weakly in her own language. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion. Fear, desperation, hope. Her tiny hands clung to his suit, refusing to let go. Evan pushed forward through the storm, using the scanner to navigate through the swirling white. As he entered the canyon, the wind's roar was replaced by an eerie silence. The walls of ice on both sides reflected the faint light from his helmet, creating ghostly shapes that seemed to move with him. The ground was uneven and slippery. He had to move carefully, one step at a time. The little girl pointed again, her voice faint. "Mom, this way." Evan tightened his grip on her and followed the direction she showed. The scanner beeped again, confirming the heat signature was close. He felt his heart beating faster. He didn't know who was waiting in that cave. He didn't know if he was walking into danger or a rescue. But he knew one thing. Someone was out there, dying in the cold, and he was the only one close enough to help. The storm outside grew wilder. But inside the canyon, Evan felt a strange calm. A sense of purpose filled him. His mission was no longer just about fixing broken machines. It was about saving a life. Maybe two. He moved deeper into the canyon, unaware that this single choice would soon change the future of both humans and aliens on this planet. The hidden cave. The icy canyon twisted and turned like a frozen maze, and the deeper Evan walked, the more silent and eerie it became. The sound of the storm outside grew distant, replaced by the soft crunch of his boots against the frozen ground and the faint hum of his suit's heater struggling to keep up with the falling temperature. The little alien girl guided him with weak gestures, her tiny hand occasionally rising from the warmth of his coat to point down the winding path. Her breathing was shallow and her shivers grew weaker, which worried Evan even more. He tightened his hold on her, pressing her closer to his chest to share as much warmth as possible. His scanner blinked weakly, its display covered in a thin layer of frost, but the faint heat signature was still ahead. Like a fragile candle flame refusing to die in the wind, Evan moved carefully, knowing that one wrong step in this slippery canyon could send both of them tumbling into hidden crevices. The walls on both sides glowed faintly from strange crystalline formations embedded in the ice, their light cold and blue, casting long ghostly reflections across the path. The sight was both beautiful and unsettling. He had walked through this canyon once before during daylight for surveying, but now, under a raging storm, it felt like stepping into another world entirely. His breath echoed inside his helmet, mixing with the little girl's faint whispers in her alien tongue. He couldn't understand her words, but the tone was filled with fear, urgency, and a child's fragile hope that this human stranger could save the one person she loved the most. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the scanner gave a soft, repetitive beep. The weak heat signature was close, just a few meters ahead. Evan turned a corner and froze for a brief second. Ahead of him was a narrow cave entrance, almost hidden by layers of wind-blown snow and hanging icicles. It was no larger than a maintenance hatch, and without the scanner, he might have walked right past it. The girl stirred weakly in his arms and pointed at the entrance, her voice barely audible. "Mom." Inside, her teeth chattered as she spoke. Evan immediately knelt, placing her carefully against the canyon wall for a moment, and pulled out his thermal cutter. He used it to break the thick ice blocking the entrance, the sound of melting ice echoing through the canyon like cracking glass. Once he cleared the way, he crawled inside first, making sure it was safe before bringing the girl in with him. Inside, the air was still freezing but calmer than outside. The cave walls shimmered with veins of glowing minerals that gave off a dim, cold light. In the center of the small cavern lay a motionless alien woman, her skin pale blue like the girl's but drained of color. She was wrapped in thin fabric that did little to protect her from the deadly cold. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and her lips were tinged with white frost. Evan rushed to her side, placing the girl next to her mother. The girl grabbed her mother's hand, whispering something in their native language with tears streaming down her face. Evan quickly activated his medical scanner, and the display flashed red. Her body temperature was dangerously low, her pulse weak. Her organs were close to shutting down from severe hypothermia. Evan didn't hesitate. He opened his emergency kit, pulling out a portable heater, thermal blankets, and a small injector filled with a warming serum used for hypothermia treatment in extreme environments. He wrapped the alien woman tightly with the thermal blanket, placing the heater beside her and setting it to maximum safe output. The little girl's eyes followed every move. As if afraid he might disappear if she blinked, Evan's hands moved quickly, years of field experience guiding him through each action. He administered the warming serum through her veins, hoping that their physiology was similar enough to humans for it to work. His scanner beeped again, giving him an estimated survival time, less than 2 hours unless he could get her proper medical care. Outside, the storm howled like a beast, and Evan knew that returning to base in this weather was impossible. Even his reinforced suit would not survive a direct journey through the full force of the blizzard with 2 additional bodies to protect. His mind raced as he considered his options. He remembered a supply outpost not too far from this canyon, a place once used by survey teams before it was abandoned. If he could reach it, he might find old med units and heating systems still operational. It wasn't perfect, but it was their best chance. He looked at the little girl, who held her mother's hand tightly, refusing to let go even as her own body trembled. She looked up at him with wet eyes, silently begging him to do something. Evan felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. He wasn't just an engineer anymore. He was their only hope. He checked his oxygen supply, the status of his suit, and the condition of the heater, then made a quick plan. He would have to carry the alien woman on his shoulders, keep the heater attached to his back, and hold the girl close to protect her from the cold. It would be extremely difficult, but he had no choice. He leaned closer to the girl and spoke slowly. "We need to go to help your mom. Understand?" She blinked and nodded weakly, trusting him completely. Evan felt a surge of determination rise inside him. This mission was no longer about survival alone. It was about saving lives, building a fragile bridge between 2 beings from different worlds in the middle of a merciless storm. He adjusted his gear, lifted the woman carefully onto his shoulders, secured the heater, and picked up the girl. The cave entrance loomed before him again, dark and dangerous, but his steps were firm. The clock was ticking, and every second mattered. The decision to risk. Everything Evan stood at the cave's narrow entrance for a long moment, staring out into the raging storm that looked more like a living wall than simple weather. The wind howled with the force of 1,000 angry beasts, lifting swirls of snow into the air and blinding everything in its path. The temperature outside had dropped even further, and his suit's sensors blinked constant warnings across his visor. But he knew staying inside the cave was not an option. The alien woman's condition was critical, and every second they spent waiting was a second closer to her body shutting down completely. His scanner had given him less than 2 hours to get her proper medical attention, and deep down he knew that was a generous estimate. He tightened the straps on his gear, adjusting the heater on his back to keep it close to the woman's body, and checked that the thermal blanket was sealed around her form to trap as much heat as possible. He then looked down at the little alien girl, her wide eyes reflecting both fear and complete trust. She didn't understand his language fully, but she understood his intention, and in that silent exchange, Evan felt a responsibility heavier than the storm itself. He took a deep breath, knowing the journey ahead would be one of the hardest he had ever faced. The supply outpost was about 3 kilometers away, which would have been a quick trek under normal weather. But in this storm the distance felt endless. It lay on the other side of several ridges and open fields, areas that would expose them to the full force of the wind. His suit had limited power, and carrying both the alien woman and the child meant his movement would be slow. He reviewed his map in his visor, marking the shortest but safest route through partially covered terrain. If he could keep moving steadily without stopping, they might make it, but if they were forced to rest too long, hypothermia would take over all of them. His hands clenched into fists, and he reminded himself why he was doing this. It wasn't just about duty or protocol. It was about the terrified child looking up at him, the fragile life on his shoulders, and the quiet voice in his heart telling him that turning away was not who he was. With slow and careful movements, he lifted the alien woman onto his shoulders, feeling her cold weight settle against him. Her body was limp, her breathing shallow, and the faint hum of the portable heater was the only sound that reminded him she was still alive. He secured her tightly with straps so she wouldn't slip during the journey, then turned to the girl and lifted her into his arms, pressing her against his chest where his suit's inner warmth would shield her from the wind. She clung to him instinctively, her small hands gripping his jacket with surprising strength despite her weakness. Evan whispered softly to her even though she might not understand. "Hold on, don't let go." Her head rested against his chest, and he could feel her shivering through the fabric. When he stepped outside, the storm slammed into him like a solid wall. The wind roared in his ears, and his vision narrowed to only what his helmet lights could cut through. Snow whipped around him in chaotic spirals, sticking to his visor and freezing instantly. He leaned forward against the wind, each step a battle. His boots sank into deep snow with every movement, forcing him to drag his legs free like he was walking through a sea of ice. The weight on his back and in his arms made every motion slower, and he could feel the strain building in his muscles. But he didn't stop. His scanner guided him through the white void, its blinking arrow the only thing keeping him from losing direction. He used the canyon walls for as long as he could to block the wind, but eventually the terrain opened into a wide field of frozen ground, and there was nothing left between them and the storm. The blizzard seemed determined to break him. Gust after gust pushed against his body, trying to knock him off his feet. At one point he stumbled and fell to one knee, the alien woman's weight almost dragging him down completely. But the sound of the little girl's frightened whimper gave him the strength to push himself back up. He gritted his teeth and forced his legs to move, counting each step in his head. One step, then another, and another. The journey became a rhythm of struggle, breath, and willpower. His visor temperature gauge showed numbers dropping steadily, and his suit's internal heater worked at maximum capacity to keep him functional. He knew the limits of this equipment, and he was pushing past them through the chaos. The little girl suddenly lifted her head and whispered something in broken human language. "Please, don't stop." Her voice was weak but filled with a desperate plea. Evan looked down at her and gave a small nod, even though she couldn't see his expression through the helmet. Her words struck something deep inside him, a reminder that his strength wasn't just his own. It came from the hope she carried in her fragile heart. He leaned forward again, shielding both of them from the wind as best as he could. He adjusted his path slightly, remembering a set of old survey beacons that might offer partial cover along the way. The field stretched endlessly before him, white and merciless. But he kept his eyes locked on the blinking marker on his visor. Time lost meaning in the storm. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The cold seeped through his suit like invisible claws, his breath fogging heavily against the inside of his helmet. His shoulders ached, his arms burned, and fatigue tried to creep into his mind like a shadow. But each time he faltered, he remembered the alien woman's weak heartbeat, the girl's fragile trust, and the knowledge that no one else would come if he failed. There was no backup, no rescue team, no guarantee of survival. It was just him, the storm, and the two lives he carried step by step, meter by meter. Evan pressed forward through the frozen wasteland, determined to reach the outpost no matter what it took. The blizzard's fury. The storm grew even more violent as Evan pushed further across the open field. It was as if the blizzard itself had sensed his determination and decided to crush it beneath its frozen weight. The wind screamed louder than before, hitting him from all directions like invisible hammers. The snow thickened until it became almost solid, swirling so fiercely that it looked like a wall of white chaos surrounding him. His helmet lights bounced off the blinding snow, making visibility nearly impossible. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, and the alien woman's weight on his shoulders seemed to double with each passing minute. The little girl clung to his chest like a fragile bird seeking shelter in a storm, her tiny hands gripping his jacket as if letting go would mean the end. Evan's breathing grew labored, fogging the inside of his visor, his heart pounding hard against his chest as he forced his frozen limbs to keep moving through the endless storm. As the temperature continued to fall, his suit's warning alarms turned into a steady chorus of beeps. Flashing red across his display, he could feel the cold trying to invade his body, seeping through the joints of his suit like icy fingers. His boots were sinking deeper into layers of snow, making each step a struggle to lift his feet out of the freezing grip of the ground. The heater attached to the alien woman hummed weakly behind him, fighting desperately to keep her core temperature stable. His scanner showed the supply outpost still far ahead, the distance shrinking painfully slowly. He calculated the time in his mind and knew that if he slowed down any further, the alien woman might not survive the journey. He bit down on the inside of his cheek, forcing his mind to stay clear. He couldn't afford panic, not here, not now. Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind slammed into his side with such force that he staggered and almost fell. The weight of the alien woman shifted dangerously, and for a terrifying second, he thought he might lose his balance completely, but he twisted his body, planting his knee deep into the snow to keep himself upright. The little girl let out a frightened cry, her voice barely audible against the roaring wind. Evan tightened his grip on her, whispering softly, "It's okay. I've got you," even though she couldn't hear him clearly. The storm howled in response, mocking his words. The gusts became more unpredictable, coming from strange angles as if the wind itself was alive. Testing his endurance, he lowered his head, adjusted his stance, and kept going, using every bit of strength he had left to maintain balance. Then, through the swirling snow, his scanner picked up something unexpected. Multiple heat signatures flickered on the display, scattered across the area ahead. For a brief moment, confusion replaced exhaustion. Out here in the middle of nowhere, no one should have been moving in this storm. The signals were faint but distinct. At first, he thought maybe his scanner was malfunctioning due to the harsh weather. But when he adjusted the frequency, the signatures remained. They were alive, moving and getting closer. His heartbeat quickened. Were they survivors from another group? Wild creatures adapted to the storm? Or worse, raiders searching for vulnerable targets in the white void? He crouched low behind a jagged ridge of snow, shielding the girl and the alien woman with his body as he peered through the blizzard. Shapes began to form within the storm, dark outlines moving against the blinding white. Evan narrowed his eyes, trying to focus, and soon realized these figures were not human. They were alien soldiers, their silhouettes tall and broad, their movements organized despite the chaotic weather. They were equipped with heavy winter armor and carried energy rifles slung across their backs. Their glowing visors cut through the storm like small beacons. Scanning the surroundings, Evan's heart pounded as he quickly analyzed the situation. The alien soldiers belonged to the same species as the girl and the woman, but he didn't know their intentions. If they mistook him for a threat while he carried their unconscious leader on his back, this mission could end in disaster. He adjusted his grip on the girl, keeping her close, and switched his helmet lights to minimum to avoid drawing attention. The alien soldiers moved methodically, sweeping the field as if searching for something. Evan realized they were probably looking for the woman and the child, but they hadn't seen him yet through the storm's thick veil. He considered his options carefully. If he stepped out too soon, they might react defensively. If he stayed hidden too long, they might move away and he would lose a potential chance for help. He studied their formation, counting the number of soldiers, 6 in total, moving in pairs, their glowing lights moving rhythmically like the beating of a giant mechanical heart. The little girl stirred in his arms and saw them too. Her eyes widened with recognition. She wriggled weakly, reaching a trembling hand toward them, whispering something in her language. Evan gently covered her hand, signaling her to stay quiet. He needed the right moment to act. Another gust of wind blew across the field, briefly clearing the snow just enough for one of the soldiers to spot the faint light of Evan's helmet. A shout echoed through the storm in the alien tongue. Sharp and commanding, the soldiers turned toward him, their lights locking onto his position. For a tense moment, Evan's instincts told him to run, but there was nowhere to go, and even if he tried, he couldn't move fast enough carrying both lives. Instead, he straightened his posture slowly, keeping the girl in his arms and making sure the woman was visible on his back wrapped in the blanket and heater. The soldiers raised their weapons. Cautious but not firing, one of them stepped forward, speaking rapidly in their language. The little girl suddenly cried out, calling to them. Her voice cracked but filled with urgency. She shouted again and again, pointing at Evan and then at her mother. The leading soldier froze for a second, then lowered his weapon slightly. He shouted something to the others, and immediately their formation changed from combat readiness to emergency support. They rushed forward through the snow, surrounding Evan not as enemies but as a protective barrier against the blizzard. One soldier quickly checked the woman's condition and barked orders. 2 others moved to support Evan, taking some of the weight off his shoulders. The relief was overwhelming. Evan's knees nearly buckled as the crushing burden he had carried began to ease. The little girl clung to him still, refusing to let go of his jacket. The soldiers formed a tight circle, shielding the group from the worst of the storm, and together they began to move toward the distant shape of the outpost that finally appeared through the wall of snow like a shadow of hope. The unexpected, Allias. The alien soldiers surrounded Evan. The storm continued to rage around them like a living creature trying to tear everything apart. But inside their tight formation, the wind's force weakened. Their heavy armored suits and energy shields created a protective barrier against the freezing air, allowing the group to move forward with greater stability. Evan felt the crushing weight on his shoulders slowly lighten as two soldiers stepped in to help support the alien woman's limp body. One of them carefully lifted her from his back, adjusting the thermal blanket and heater so that the heat continued to flow into her fragile form. Evan staggered slightly as the burden was lifted, his muscles screaming from exhaustion, his breath coming out in heavy, foggy bursts inside his helmet. The little alien girl still clung to him tightly, her small face pressed against his chest, refusing to let go even as her people surrounded them. Her trembling fingers gripped his jacket with the strength born of fear, as if letting go of the human who had saved her would somehow make the nightmare return. The leading alien soldier stepped closer to Evan, towering over him with a mix of authority and caution. The alien's armor was coated with layers of frost, his glowing visor shining through the storm like a focused beam. He raised his hand slowly, signaling for Evan to lower his guard. The language barrier was still there, but their gestures carried meaning. Evan responded by raising his free hand slightly, showing he had no weapons. His other arm held the girl close to keep her warm. The soldier then spoke quickly in his native language, his voice firm but not hostile. It sounded like a mix of military commands and questions. Evan couldn't understand a single word, but the little girl did. She wriggled in his arms, shouting something back to the soldier with a desperate tone. Her words were broken and rushed, but her meaning was clear to them. She was explaining what had happened, how this strange human had come through the storm and carried both her and her dying mother to safety. The soldiers' formation shifted subtly as they listened to the girl's frantic voice. Weapons lowered, their aggressive posture softened. The leading soldier tilted his head slightly as if surprised. He stepped closer and carefully examined the alien woman wrapped in the blanket and connected to Evan's portable heater. His gloved hand hovered over the heater, feeling the warmth radiating from it. His visor display flickered with readings as he scanned her condition, and then he turned his gaze back to Evan. For a tense moment their eyes met, human and alien. Two strangers bound by a storm and a dying life. The soldier gave a short, sharp order to his squad immediately. Two soldiers adjusted their formation to give more protection from the wind, while the others began to move forward through the storm, escorting Evan and the two precious lives he had carried. As they moved together, Evan found himself walking in the center of a living shield. The alien soldiers positioned themselves in a way that blocked the blizzard from every angle. Their armor absorbed the brunt of the icy wind while their energy shields carved a narrow tunnel of relative safety through the storm. For the first time since he had stepped out of the cave, Evan could actually breathe without feeling like the air itself wanted to freeze his lungs. He stumbled slightly as his exhaustion caught up with him, but the leading soldier caught his arm, steadying him with surprising gentleness. There was no hostility in their movements anymore, only urgency and focus. The little girl looked up at the soldier holding her mother and shouted something again, her voice shaky but filled with hope. The soldier carrying her mother responded in their language, and although Evan didn't understand the words, he could hear the determination in the tone. The march through the storm felt different now. Before, Evan had walked alone against an unstoppable force, but now he moved within a unit, their combined strength turning the blizzard into something survivable. His mind, however, was still alert. He knew that trust was fragile between species, and misunderstandings could happen easily, especially in moments of high pressure. But the way the soldiers treated the unconscious woman told him everything he needed to know. They recognized her, and they cared. Their quick and coordinated movements were not the actions of strangers. They were the actions of people protecting someone important. Perhaps she was a leader, or maybe someone of great value in their community. Either way, Evan understood that bringing her back alive would change how these aliens saw him. After what felt like endless trudging through blinding snow, a dark shape emerged in the distance through the storm. The outline of the abandoned supply outpost slowly appeared like a ghost rising from the white void. The structure was partially buried in snow, its metal surface coated in thick layers of ice. The antennas were bent and broken, and the old warning lights blinked weakly in the wind. It was not much, but to Evan it was salvation. The soldiers seemed to recognize the place as well. They moved with increased speed, almost like a pack sensing shelter after a brutal hunt. Two of them rushed ahead to clear the entrance while the others kept the formation around Evan. When they finally reached the outpost, the soldiers forced open the frozen metal doors using both strength and tools. The sound of cracking ice and grinding hinges echoed through the storm. Inside, the air was cold but still compared to the chaos outside. Dim emergency lights flickered, casting long shadows across the dusty walls. The alien soldiers carried the woman inside with urgency. While Evan followed closely, still holding the little girl, she looked around with wide, frightened eyes, clinging to him like he was her anchor in this strange place. One soldier gestured for him to follow as they moved deeper into the facility, searching for a functioning med unit. The outpost's interior smelled like rust and old metal. Every step echoed through the empty halls, and frost crept along the walls like veins. The soldiers communicated rapidly in their language, splitting into groups to activate systems, check power levels, and find medical equipment. Evan placed the girl gently on a bench near a wall heater and immediately joined them, using his knowledge of human tech to reboot some of the old generators. His fingers moved quickly over the controls, rerouting power to the medical bay. The lights flickered brighter, and old machinery hummed weakly to life. The soldiers glanced at him with silent acknowledgement, a rare, unspoken respect forming in the cold air, the race against time, inside the outpost. The cold air pressed against their faces like a silent reminder that time was slipping away. The structure groaned under the weight of snow piled on its roof. The lights flickered uncertainly, and every sound echoed in the empty metallic halls. The alien soldiers wasted no time, moving with precise coordination as if they had trained for situations like this countless times before. They laid the alien woman on an old but sturdy medical table in what used to be the outpost's infirmary. Her skin had turned a dangerously pale shade of blue, her breathing shallow, and her pulse barely detectable even with advanced scanners. Evan stood beside them, his muscles aching, his body exhausted, but his mind sharper than ever. He knew that everything he had endured through the storm was for this single moment, and failure was not an option. The soldiers surrounded the woman with focused urgency, speaking rapidly in their language, their voices echoing through the cold room like a chorus of determination. Evan scanned the equipment around him, most of it covered in frost and long abandoned. He wiped a thin layer of ice from the control panel of the main medical unit, his gloved fingers moving across the cracked screen. The system was old, outdated, but still functional if given enough power. He rushed to the generator controls at the side of the room, flipping switches and rerouting circuits. The humming sound of ancient machinery slowly returned, like a heartbeat awakening after a long sleep. The lights above flickered brighter, casting a steady glow across the room. The alien soldiers watched him for a moment, then split into tasks that complemented his actions. One began attaching monitoring cables to the woman's arms. Another checked the fluid levels in the thermal pods, while two others secured the perimeter to make sure the storm wouldn't breach the walls. It was an unspoken alliance, humans and aliens working side by side with no words, only shared urgency. The little alien girl sat on a nearby bench, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching everything with wide, tear-filled eyes. Her tiny hands were clasped together as if she was praying in silence. Her gaze never left her mother's still form lying on the table. Evan felt the weight of that gaze on his shoulders, a quiet plea to not let her down. He pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain in his arms and the fatigue pressing against his mind. He opened a compartment on the wall and pulled out a portable power core. Hooking it into the medical unit to give it a surge of energy, Sparks flew for a moment, and the old machine let out a low whir, then stabilized. The alien soldiers murmured to each other, their tones shifting from doubt to hope. They began working faster, their movements synchronized with his. When the pod door finally opened with a hiss of pressurized air, they carefully lifted the alien woman and placed her inside. Evan adjusted the heater around her body to maintain a stable temperature as the alien soldier connected life support tubes and thermal stimulators. The pod lights turned on, scanning her body from head to toe, and immediately the screen flashed red warnings. Her organs were shutting down one by one, and her heart rhythm was weak. Evan's eyes narrowed, and he began adjusting the settings manually, bypassing the system's old safety protocols to push more energy into the thermal circulation. He rerouted power from unnecessary systems, shutting down lights in other sections of the outpost just to give the medical bay more juice. His hands moved fast, guided by instinct and experience. The alien soldiers watched his every move, one stepping closer to assist as if sensing his urgency. Together, they formed a seamless rhythm, like two different species united by one goal. The machine's alarms echoed through the room like a countdown clock, and sweat began to gather on Evan's forehead despite the freezing air. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of the warning sounds. The alien soldier assisting him started reading out numbers in their language, while Evan watched the display carefully, adjusting dials and inputs based on the readings. Slowly, the woman's body temperature began to rise. The red flashing lights turned orange, then yellow. Her heart rhythm, once faint and unstable, started to find a fragile but steady beat. The girl on the bench covered her mouth with both hands as tears streamed down her cheeks. The alien soldiers exchanged quick glances, their rigid, disciplined faces softening with a spark of hope. But the fight wasn't over. A sudden surge caused the system to flicker, and for a terrifying moment the power core dimmed. Threatening to shut down everything, Evan reacted instantly, sprinting to the generator and slamming a manual override lever that sent raw power back into the med unit. The lights burst back to full brightness. The machines roared to life and the alarms quieted one by one. The alien soldiers let out sharp breaths of relief. Their commander stepped forward and placed a firm, gloved hand on Evan's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of his determination and skill. Evan didn't stop to respond. He turned back to the pod, watching as the life support readings finally stabilized. The pod's lights shifted from yellow to a steady green, signaling that the woman was finally out of immediate danger. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the medical equipment. The alien soldiers stood around the pod, their heads slightly bowed, not in sadness but in solemn respect for the battle they had just fought together. The little girl ran toward her mother, stopping just short of the pod, placing her tiny hand on the glass. Her eyes shined with tears and relief. She whispered something softly, a single word that even Evan didn't need translated. It was a word filled with gratitude and love. Evan leaned against the wall, his body finally acknowledging the exhaustion he had been holding back for hours. His legs ached, his arms felt heavy, and his breath came in deep, tired waves, but inside his chest, there was a quiet warmth. He looked around the room, at the alien soldiers working calmly now, at the girl's tearful smile, at the woman lying safely inside the pod, and he understood that this night had changed something deeper than he could put into words. They weren't enemies here, not rescuers and strangers, but a team brought together by necessity and compassion, and in that cold, silent room, surrounded by two species who had once looked at each other with suspicion, a fragile bridge of trust had been built. A bond forged in ice hours passed inside the old supply outpost, the storm outside still howling but slowly beginning to weaken. The once chaotic and freezing halls now carried a quiet sense of safety, illuminated by the warm hum of generators and the steady rhythm of the medical pod keeping the alien woman alive. Evan sat on the cold floor beside the wall, his helmet resting next to him, his hair damp from melted frost, his body aching in every muscle. The exhaustion that had been pushed aside for survival finally caught up to him, but it was mixed with something deeper than fatigue, a quiet, powerful feeling of relief. The little alien girl sat beside the pod, wrapped in a thick blanket, her eyes never leaving her mother's sleeping form inside the glowing chamber. Occasionally she would reach out to touch the glass, whispering softly in her language, as if her words could reach through the layers and comfort her mother. The alien soldiers moved quietly around the room, checking systems, repairing damaged panels, and standing guard near the entrance, but their once rigid and suspicious posture had softened when they looked at Evan. They no longer saw a stranger fighting against the storm alone, but someone who had risked everything for lives that were not his own. The alien commander, a tall figure with a scar running across his armored shoulder, approached Evan slowly. His heavy boots echoed through the quiet room. He stopped in front of the human and studied him silently for a long moment. His glowing visor reflected the soft light of the pod, revealing no emotions, but his body language spoke clearly. He extended his arm toward Evan in a gesture that carried both authority and respect. Evan hesitated for a brief second, unsure of alien customs, but then he reached out and clasped the offered forearm. The commander gripped firmly, their hands locked in a warrior's handshake that needed no shared language. In that moment, words were unnecessary. The action spoke louder than any translator could. It was the gesture of one protector to another, an acknowledgement of courage, sacrifice, and shared humanity across species. The commander spoke a few words in his language. His tone steady and solemn, Evan didn't understand, but he felt their weight settle warmly in his chest. The little girl noticed the handshake and hurried toward Evan. She threw her tiny arms around him without hesitation, her small body pressing against his chest as she buried her face into his suit. Her tears soaked the fabric. But this time they were tears of joy, not fear. She mumbled something repeatedly in her language, the same word over and over again, and one of the soldiers nearby softly translated it into broken human speech. Protector. Protector. The word echoed inside Evan's mind, simple yet powerful. It wasn't a title he had expected. He wasn't a soldier, not a hero from legends, just an engineer who couldn't walk away from a child crying in the snow. But to her, to this little alien girl, he had become something far more than that. He gently placed a hand on her head, his fingers brushing against her frost-chilled hair, and for the first time since the storm began, he allowed himself a faint, tired smile as dawn approached. The storm finally began to ease. The howling winds weakened to gentle whispers, and the thick curtain of snow outside started to settle, revealing the frozen world under the pale light of a rising sun. Reinforcements from the alien colony arrived in heavy vehicles, their engines roaring against the silence. A group of medics and guards entered the outpost, their expressions turning from urgency to astonishment when they saw the scene inside. Alien soldiers and a lone human sitting together, united by survival and shared struggle. They rushed to the pod, checking the woman's condition, and confirmed what the soldiers already knew. She was stable, alive, and recovering. The commander gave a series of sharp orders, preparing to transport her back to their main settlement for advanced care. Before they left, the commander gestured for Evan to stand beside the pod. He obeyed, still a little unsure of what was happening. The alien soldiers formed a line and stood at attention, their armor gleaming under the soft light. The little girl stepped forward, her blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders, and looked up at Evan with wide, determined eyes. She raised her small hand and placed it over her heart, bowing her head slightly. The commander and the soldiers mirrored the gesture. A solemn sign of honor in their culture. Evan stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of what was happening. In their eyes, he was no longer just a human who wandered into their storm. He was the one who carried their leader on his back through death's icy grip, the one who didn't turn away, the one who showed warmth when the world was frozen, when they finally departed. The alien medics carefully moved the woman into their transport. The little girl refused to ride with anyone except Evan, and the commander allowed it without hesitation. She sat beside him, holding his arm tightly as the vehicle rumbled across the frozen plains. She didn't say much, but her presence spoke enough. She had found safety in him. Trust that transcended language or species. Evan stared out the window at the melting storm, his mind quiet for the first time in what felt like forever. He didn't know what the future held, whether he would see them again, or how this night would ripple through the fragile relations between humans and aliens. But something deep inside him told him that this act, this single night of choice, had changed far more than just 3 lives. In the alien city, as they arrived, crowds gathered silently to see their leader being brought home alive. Stories spread quickly, carried through whispers and radio signals, about a lone human who had walked through the storm carrying life on his shoulders. Alien children peered curiously at Evan. Adults nodded respectfully, and the little girl walked beside him proudly as if introducing a hero. The commander spoke to his people, his voice echoing through loudspeakers. And although Evan couldn't understand the language, the way they looked at him said everything. He had earned their respect, not through power or force, but through kindness and relentless determination. That night would be remembered by both species for years to come. It became known as the Night of the Stormwalker, a story passed down through alien families and eventually retold among humans. A story not of war, but of compassion, not of conquest, but of trust. And somewhere in the quiet corners of that alien city, a little girl would always remember the human who heard her cry in the snow and answered with everything he had. In the frozen silence of that deadly night, a bond had been forged, not through treaties or politics, but through courage, warmth, and a single act of selfless humanity.